Okay, everybody, let's get going. So we are going to be talking about roundworms now. So this is phylum Nematoda. So we've been talking about phylum Platyhelminthes, which is the flatworms. So these guys are a little bit more complex. They have a little bit more developmental advantages compared to the flatworms. So the common name for a nematode or nematoda is the roundworms. And they have long, thin bodies that are tapered at both ends, like you can see in this top left-hand picture, or if you look closely down here. These worms are fairly common, and we'll talk about where they're found here in just a moment. So first of all, developmentally, they are pseudocoelomates. So they have what we call a false coelom. And a pseudocoelomate, or something with a false coelom, they have the fluid-filled cavity, the coelom, but it's only partially lined with mesoderm tissue. So that part right there, the only partially lined with mesoderm tissue, that's the important part. Okay, so the acoelomates, which are the flatworms, they do not have a coelom at all, but they do have mesoderm tissue. The pseudocoelomates have a coelom, only partially lined with mesoderm tissue. And then the true coelomates that we'll study here soon, in about a week, they have a full coelom that's completely lined with mesoderm tissue, so that's the difference. Now they can be a big variety of size, from a millimeter to 4 feet. If you look at like how thick your fingernail is, that's just a couple of millimeters right there. Now, one of their big advances is their digestive system. So they have this tube within a tube digestive system, we call it. The inner tube is the digestive tract, so that's like where they absorb their nutrients from. And the outer tube is the actual body wall. Something else that's different on roundworms compared to everything else that we've looked at so far, everything else that we've looked at so far, like the cnidarians and also the flatworms, have only had one opening into their body where they bring food in and they also get rid of waste. These guys actually have two openings, so they have a mouth and an anus. So food enters the mouth, waste leaves the body through the anus, and this is significantly more advanced than the gastrovascular cavity that we've seen in the previous animals we've studied, because now we have food moving only in one direction instead of back and forth. In a tube within a tube digestive system, different parts of the digestive tract are specialized and carry out different functions. So we're starting to see an increase in complexity in this particular animal group compared to everything else we've studied. Now, most roundworms are free-living, whereas the flatworms that we studied, most of those guys are parasites. But there are parasitic species in the roundworms. And for those of you that are interested in veterinarian medicine, you'll come across these guys for sure. There's about 15,000 species of roundworms worldwide, but scientists think there could be as many as 500,000 species, so 500,000. 4 out of 5 animals on Earth are nematodes. Think about what I just said. 4 out of 5 of all living animals on this planet are nematodes. I once had a professor in college when I went to Westminster that told me if you could be in outer space and if you could remove all life from this land, all plants, all rock, all soil, all dirts, and if you just left behind nothing but nematodes, you could still see all the continents because they are that numerous in the soil and the rocks. Now, the majority of roundworms are free-living, like I just said, but there's about 150 that are parasitic, and remember, we think there's around 15,000. So common examples of some of these parasitic ones, and I'm going to talk about these, are Ascaris, something called a hookworm, which is terrifying, Trichinella or Trichina, and then pinworms. This picture right here that you see, this is a hookworm, and I think you can probably see why. So let's talk about Ascaris first. This is one that's very common if you're going to go into veterinarian medicine for sure. This is an intestinal worm that lives in the intestines of pigs, horses, dogs, humans, cats. When you deworm your dogs and cats, this is one of the worms. It's not the only, but it's one of the worms that dewormer takes care of. I've personally had some dogs with this, so I've actually seen this worm many times. These guys can become so numerous in the digestive system, in the intestines, that they completely block the intestines of the host, which is obviously a very dangerous medical condition. Like most parasites, they are reproductive machines, so the female can produce up to 200,000 eggs a day. Crazy. Should probably go back. That was a little bit fast. Sorry about that. Now, hookworms, as the name implies, their mouth has these cutting hooks that you can see that's characteristic of them. And they use these to clamp on the intestinal wall of whoever they're infecting. They feed on the host's blood. The larvae live in soil, and then they can enter the host by boring through the bottom of the host's feet. And I've heard all sorts of reports of people on a vacation in a beautiful tropical paradise walking along the beach with their bare feet. And they don't know that they're actually walking all over these larvae, and they get in their feet, and they end up having to be treated when they come back from their vacation. Hookworms infect about 1 billion people worldwide, and like I was just saying, mostly they're found in tropical and subtropical regions. I saw a story on the news, and I couldn't find it when I looked for a video of it, but I saw a story on the news of a Utah couple that got this from walking on a beach in a tropical region. Now, trichinella is another one of these nematodes, one of these parasitic nematodes. Trichinella worms live in the intestine, but they produce larvae that form cysts in the muscles. And this is something that we used to have to worry about a little bit more often in the United States, but not so much anymore. People become infected when they eat undercooked meat, so mussels, and it's usually found in pork. That is contaminated with these cysts. And the disease is called trichinosis. So trichina worms can cause the disease trichinosis, which causes extreme muscle pain and stiffness as the cysts form in the muscles. It can even cause death when there's a lot of these cysts, and especially if they get into the heart muscle. For obvious reasons, it would cause death. Pinworms is another, and this one's more common than you may think, and you might know about it yourselves, your families. They're the most common roundworm parasite in humans in the United States. So school-age children have the highest infection rate, which can reach up to 50% of the kids in that area can be affected at some times. It's a little bit gross to talk about, but they are pretty common. They don't cause serious damage. They live and mate in the lower intestine of people, and at night, and this is the part that's a little disturbing, at night the females migrate out of the intestine and then they lay their eggs on the skin around the anus of the child. These eggs are then spread to anything that the person touches. And so parents actually that have children with this, that's actually one of the ways, and I know it's really interesting, or I'm not sure, delicate to talk about, but they'll like go into and look at their child with a flashlight at nighttime looking for these things if the doctor suspects that this is what's going on. Filarial worms, you've heard of a disease that these guys have caused before, and I'll show you some pictures of that in just a second. Filarial worms are disease-causing roundworms that infect 250,000 people in tropical countries, so it's not really a concern here in the United States. Larvae are present in the bloodstream of the host, and they're picked up by mosquitoes when mosquitoes bite an infected person. The larvae are transmitted to a new person when the mosquito bites again. Now this is what they can cause. This is something called elephantiasis. So the lymph node gets infested with these filarial worms. The larvae live in that lymphatic system, which is a part of the circulatory system that collects excess water around the cells and returns it to the blood. So since they're messing with that system, you get all this fluid retention that causes these weird growths. When present in large numbers, filarial worms can block the lymphatic vessels, causing fluid to accumulate in the limbs. And this condition, like what you see in that picture right there, is called elephantiasis. The limbs become extremely swollen and the skin thickens and hardens. It can be really devastating. Now, to avoid parasitic worms, there's a few things that you can do. Good meat inspection is always a good idea. Always cook meats thoroughly before consuming them. There's reasons we have these rules. Wear shoes in areas occupied by host animals, like where there's barns and pastures, etc. Wear protective clothing when wading in waters that may be infested with parasites. And usually there's warnings about that in these areas. Okay, and that's it.